Picture this. A longship cuts through the misty fjords, returning home after months of raiding. But contrary to what Hollywood might have you believe, these fearsome Norse warriors weren't just heading back to feast on massive haunches of meat and horns of mead. No, waiting in their settlements were gardens and wild harvest spots tended by the people who truly kept Viking society alive. The farmers. The Vikings, those legendary seafarers, traders, and occasionally terrifying raiders, were fundamentally an agricultural society. While their warriors were off discovering Columbus, or trading in Constantinople, the majority of Norse people were at home, coaxing food from the challenging northern soils and coastal areas of Scandinavia. Their diet was far more diverse and plant-based than our modern imaginations might suggest. Today, I'm going to take you on a journey through the forgotten vegetable gardens of the Viking Age. We'll explore 12 remarkable plants that nourished Norse communities through harsh winters and brief growing seasons. Vegetables that have largely disappeared from our modern tables. These aren't just botanical curiosities. They represent ingenious adaptations to a challenging environment and showcase that sophisticated understanding Vikings had of their natural world. From protein-packed wild greens to frost-resistant root vegetables that could survive the harshest Nordic winters, these plants tell us a story about resilience, resourcefulness, and the intimate relationship our ancestors had with their environment. So grab your wooden bowl and bone spoon. We're about to feast on knowledge that's been buried for 1,000 years. 1. Angelica. Angelica archangelica. If plants had celebrity status in the Viking world, Angelica would have been their A-lister. This tall, aromatic herb with its distinctive umbrella-shaped flower clusters wasn't just a garden ornament. It was medicinal gold and culinary treasure, all rolled into one sturdy, celery-like stalk. Native to the subarctic regions of northern Europe, Angelica was perfectly adapted to the Viking homelands. Growing up to 6 feet tall, with hollow stems and sweet-smelling flowers, it must have been an impressive sight in the modest Norse gardens. Archaeological findings from Viking settlements consistently show Angelica seeds and remnants, suggesting it wasn't just gathered wild, but actively cultivated near their homes. The Vikings called it kvan, or kavan, and it held a status somewhere between food, medicine, and mystical plant. According to Norse tradition, Angelica was revealed to humanity by the archangel Raphael, hence its Latin name, as a cure for plague. Though this Christian association likely came later as the Vikings converted from their pagan beliefs. Nutritionally speaking, Angelica was a powerhouse, rich in vitamin C, which was absolutely crucial during those long, scurvy-threatening winters when fresh fruits were but a distant memory. The entire plant was utilised. Roots were harvested in the fall, stems and leaves in the spring, and seeds later in the summer. Talk about efficient food systems. In the kitchen, young Angelica stems were candied with honey, a rare and precious sweetener in Viking times, to preserve them and create a treat that doubled as medicine. The leaves were added to stews and soups, lending a distinct aromatic quality somewhere between celery, juniper, and musk. The roots, particularly potent, were often steeped in alcohol to create medicinal tinctures that helped with everything from digestive issues to respiratory problems. Perhaps most interestingly, Angelica stems were chewed raw during long sea voyages to prevent scurvy, making them the Viking equivalent of a multivitamin. Imagine those fierce warriors chomping on Angelica stalks between raids. So why did this versatile plant fall from grace? As international trade expanded, more exotic spices and medicines became available. Angelica's strong, distinctive flavour gradually fell out of fashion as more delicate herbs took centre stage. Modern agriculture favoured faster-growing, less temperamental crops. And Angelica, which takes 2 years to mature and can be finicky to cultivate, simply couldn't compete economically. Today, Angelica survives primarily in traditional Scandinavian spirits like aquavit and in some specialised candies, but its days as a dietary staple are long gone. The plant that once helped Vikings survive brutal winters has been relegated to the dusty pages of herbal history books. A forgotten superfood from an age when people couldn't afford to ignore the power of plants. 2. Brassica rapa, Navew. Before there was the turnip as we know it today, there was Navew, the overlooked ancestor that kept Viking communities fed through countless harsh winters. If vegetables had family reunions, Navew would be the grandfather that modern turnips, rutabagas, and rapeseed all descended from. Navew looks like a skinnier, elongated turnip. Imagine a vegetable having a growth spurt during adolescence, and you'll get the picture. Archaeological excavations at Viking settlements across Scandinavia have unearthed carbonised Navew seeds, confirming this humble root vegetable was a staple in Norse agriculture from at least the 8th century. The beauty of Navew for Viking farmers lay in its incredible hardiness. This vegetable could survive conditions that would make modern crops curl up and surrender. It thrived in the short growing seasons of northern Europe, tolerated poor soils, and, crucially, could be stored through winter in cool, dry places, or even left in the ground in milder coastal areas, creating a living larder for hungry families. Viking cultivation methods for Navew were straightforward but effective. Seeds were typically sown in early summer in raised beds, a technique that improved drainage in the often waterlogged Nordic soils. The Vikings practiced a form of crop rotation, understanding that brassicas like Navew would deplete certain soil nutrients if planted in the same location year after year. Instead, they would follow Navew with nitrogen-fixing crops or allow fields to lie fallow, demonstrating an ecological understanding that was surprisingly sophisticated. Nutritionally, Navew was a powerhouse, rich in vitamins C and B, minerals, and complex carbohydrates. The entire plant was utilised in Viking kitchens. The roots provided starchy energy, while the tender green tops offered vital nutrients during the hunger months of late winter and early spring, when fresh food was scarce. Talk about nose-to-tail eating. This was root-to-leaf consumption at its finest. In the cooking pot, Navew was incredibly versatile. The roots were boiled, mashed, or added to stews alongside whatever meats or fish were available. The greens could be quickly wilted, like modern spinach. Archaeological evidence from cooking pots has revealed traces of Navew cooked with herbs like thyme and juniper berries, a flavour combination that would actually be quite appealing to modern palates. Perhaps most interestingly, Navew was sometimes fermented in a process similar to making sauerkraut, creating a preserved food that provided beneficial probiotics and could last for months. Viking gut health was apparently centuries ahead of our modern kombucha obsession. So why did Navew fade into obscurity? As with many heritage vegetables, it was largely a victim of agricultural standardisation. When farming became more commercialised, the rounder, faster-growing modern turnip varieties were favoured for their uniform shape and size, better suited to mechanical harvesting and packing. Navew, with its irregular, elongated form, simply wasn't compatible with industrial agriculture. Additionally, changing tastes played a role. As more diverse foods became available, the strong, sometimes bitter flavour of Navew fell out of favour. Today, Navew survives primarily in seed banks and the gardens of dedicated heritage vegetable enthusiasts. The vegetable that once sustained Viking communities through countless winters has been replaced by its more commercially viable descendants, a living example of how our food system has sacrificed diversity for convenience. Tredje skirwhite, Meum athamanticum. If you've never heard of skirwhite, also known as spignal or bald money, you're not alone. This once prized root vegetable has fallen so far into obscurity that even most food historians give it barely a passing mention. Yet for Viking communities, particularly those in the more mountainous regions of Scandinavia, this aromatic perennial was both food staple and medicine cabinet in one neat package. Skirwhite looks somewhat like a parsnip's wilder, more aromatic cousin, with delicate, feathery foliage above ground and a long, tapering root below. What made it particularly valuable to Viking farmers was its extreme hardiness and ability to thrive in poor, rocky soils, where other crops would simply give up and die. Archaeological excavations at several Viking farmsteads have uncovered skir-white seeds and root fragments, particularly in Norway and parts of Sweden, suggesting it was deliberately cultivated rather than simply foraged. The plant's Norse name has been lost to time, but we know from later medieval texts that it was highly regarded throughout Northern Europe. By the Viking Age, it was already being cultivated in small garden plots, typically in well-drained areas with some protection from the harshest winds. Unlike many vegetables that require annual replanting, skir-white is a perennial that comes back year after year, making it an efficient crop for communities that needed to maximise their limited growing season. Nutritionally, skir-white packed a serious punch. The roots contain significant amounts of essential oils, starches, and compounds that we now know have anti-inflammatory properties. Vikings didn't have nutritional science, but they recognised that people who regularly consumed skir-white seemed to suffer less from winter ailments and digestive troubles. The roots were particularly valued for their warming properties, something you'd definitely appreciate during those long, dark Nordic winters. In Viking cooking, skir-white roots were typically harvested in late autumn when their flavour was at its peak. They could be roasted in the embers of a fire, boiled in stews, or dried and ground into a powder that added both nutrition and flavour to winter porridges. The taste is quite distinctive. Imagine a complex blend of parsley, licorice, and earthy notes that would have added welcome variety to the sometimes monotonous winter diet. Perhaps most interestingly, skir-white was considered an important medicinal plant. The roots were steeped in ale to create a tonic for digestive ailments and respiratory infections. Some archaeological evidence suggests it may have been one of the plants carried by Viking explorers on their long sea voyages as both food and medicine, the multivitamin of its day. So why did this versatile plant disappear from our gardens and kitchens? The decline of skir-white began with the introduction of more productive root crops like potatoes in the post-Viking era. Its strong, distinctive flavour gradually fell out of fashion as European tastes shifted toward milder foods. Additionally, skir-white is slow to establish from seed, taking 2 years to produce a decent-sized root, a timeline that became increasingly impractical as agriculture modernised and annual yields became the focus. Today, skir-white survives primarily as a curiosity in botanical gardens and in a few remote mountain areas of Scotland and Norway, where traditional knowledge has preserved its use. The plant that once helped Vikings survive harsh winters has been reduced to a botanical footnote, a forgotten flavour from a time when people had a much more intimate relationship with their local environment. 4. Fat Hen Chenopodium album. If weeds could talk, Fat Hen would have quite the story to tell. From respected Viking vegetable to reviled garden nuisance, its fall from grace is perhaps the most dramatic of all our forgotten foods. Today's gardeners spend countless hours trying to eradicate this persistent plant, completely unaware that their ancestors once deliberately cultivated it as a nutritional powerhouse. Fat hen, also known as white goosefoot or lamb's quarters, is an unassuming annual plant with diamond-shaped leaves and a slightly mealy texture. It grows quickly, produces abundant seeds, and can thrive in disturbed soil, all qualities that made it invaluable to Viking farmers dealing with Scandinavia's short-growing season. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements tells us that fat hen wasn't just tolerated, it was actively managed. Seeds have been found stored alongside more familiar crops like barley and rye, suggesting deliberate collection and planting. At the famous Viking settlement at Jorvik, modern-day York, England, excavations revealed substantial quantities of fat hen seeds in storage pits, confirming its importance in the Norse diet. Cultivation of fat hen required minimal effort. Nature did most of the work. Vikings would simply allow it to grow in fallow fields or along the edges of their grain crops, occasionally transplanting it to dedicated garden areas. Its ability to self-seed meant that once established, it would reliably return year after year. In many ways, it represented sustainable food production at its finest. Abundant yields with minimal input. Nutritionally, fat hen makes modern superfoods look positively lazy. It contains more iron and protein than cabbage, more calcium and vitamin B1 than spinach, and significant amounts of vitamins A and C. For Viking communities facing the constant threat of nutritional deficiencies, especially during late winter and early spring, fat hen was literally life-saving medicine, disguised as a humble green. In the Viking kitchen, young fat hen leaves were harvested throughout the growing season and eaten both fresh and cooked. They could be added to stews, boiled briefly like spinach, or mixed with other foraged greens. The seeds, tiny but produced in abundance, were ground and added to flour for bread making, providing protein and essential fatty acids. Some archaeological evidence suggests the seeds were also fermented to produce a primitive beer-like beverage. Perhaps most importantly, fat hen was one of the first green plants to emerge in spring, providing vital nutrients during the hunger gap when winter stores were depleted, but new crops weren't yet ready. In this role, it served as nature's multivitamin, helping prevent the scurvy and other deficiency diseases that plagued agricultural societies dependent on stored grains. So why did this nutritional powerhouse fall from our plates? The decline began with the introduction of more prestigious vegetables like spinach, which was considered more refined despite being nutritionally inferior. As agriculture became more commercialised, fat hen's tendency to grow enthusiastically, some might say aggressively, made it a competitor to commercial crops. Gradually, perception shifted from valuable food plant to troublesome weed. The final blow came with modern herbicides, which targeted broadleaf plants growing among cereal crops, precisely fat hen's traditional, ecological niche. Within a few generations, the knowledge of fat hen as food was almost completely lost in Western cultures, though it remains an important vegetable in parts of Africa, India and Mexico. Today, this plant that once sustained Viking communities through countless springs is more likely to end up in the compost bin than on dinner plates. A sobering reminder of how quickly valuable traditional knowledge can be lost when our relationship with food becomes disconnected from its ecological context. 5. Sea kale, Crambe maritima. Along the windswept shores of Viking territories, where the boundary between land and sea blurred with each tide, grew a remarkable vegetable that perfectly embodied Norse resourcefulness. Sea kale, with its waxy blue-green leaves and ability to thrive in seemingly inhospitable coastal environments, was the Viking equivalent of coastal gold. This perennial member of the brassica family looks somewhat like ruffled cabbage leaves sprouting directly from the beach. Its deep taproot anchors it against fierce coastal winds, while its waxy coating protects against salt spray, adaptations that made it perfectly suited to the coastal settlements where many Viking communities established themselves. Archaeological evidence for sea kale consumption comes primarily from midden, trash heap, excavations at coastal Viking sites, where the distinctive seed pods have been identified among food waste. Written references are sparse, but later Norse texts mention a valuable coastal plant with edible spring shoots that matches sea kale's description perfectly. Unlike many crops that required carefully prepared fields, sea kale essentially cultivated itself along shorelines. Vikings likely practiced a form of wild management, protecting existing plants, scattering seeds in suitable new locations, and harvesting sustainably to ensure future growth. Some evidence suggests they may have deliberately covered wild plants with beach pebbles or sand in late winter, a technique that produces tender, blanched shoots in early spring. Nutritionally, sea kale was another Viking superfood. Extremely rich in vitamin C, it provided crucial protection against scurvy during winter months when fresh foods were scarce. It also contained significant amounts of iodine, essential for thyroid function and often lacking in inland diets. For coastal Viking communities, sea kale offered nutritional insurance against the deficiencies that commonly plagued medieval populations. In the cooking pot, sea kale was remarkably versatile. The young spring shoots, which emerge purple-tinged before turning green, were the most prized part, harvested when just 6 to 8 inches tall and prepared similarly to asparagus. The mature leaves could be cooked like cabbage, while the thick leaf midribs were prepared like sea kale's distant cousin, broccoli. Even the roots could be eaten in times of scarcity, providing emergency nutrition during lean periods. Perhaps most ingeniously, Vikings discovered that sea kale could be preserved through fermentation, creating a vitamin-rich food that lasted through winter. Archaeological evidence from several coastal settlements has revealed pottery vessels containing residues consistent with fermented brassicas, suggesting this preservation technique was widely practiced. Sea kale's decline began with changing land use patterns in the post-medieval period. Coastal areas became more densely populated, and wild sea kale was over-harvested to near extinction in many regions. By the 18th century, it had become a luxury vegetable in parts of Europe, commercially blanched under pots and sold at premium prices, a far cry from its status as common coastal food during the Viking Age. The final blow came with changing food preferences and agricultural industrialization. Sea kale doesn't lend itself to mechanical harvesting or long-distance transport, and its strong flavour fell out of favour as milder vegetables became the preference. Today, this once vital coastal resource survives primarily as an ornamental plant, and in a few specialised heritage gardens. The loss of sea kale from our diets represents more than just one forgotten vegetable. It symbolises our disconnection from local food systems that once tied communities intimately to their immediate environment. Vikings didn't need to import vegetables from thousands of miles away. They simply needed to know where to look in their own backyard, or in this case, their own beachfront. Sixth, orpine, Sedum telefium. In the rockiest corners of Viking settlements, where other crops struggled to take hold, a succulent plant with fleshy leaves and clusters of starry pink flowers provided both food and medicine. Orpine, also called livelong or house leek, might be the most overlooked vegetable in Viking history, yet archaeological evidence suggests it was deliberately cultivated throughout Scandinavia. Orpine looks somewhat like a sturdier version of modern jade plants, with thick water-storing leaves growing in rosettes. This drought-resistant perennial could survive in the shallow, rocky soils that characterised many Norse settlements, making it a reliable food source in areas where traditional field agriculture was challenging. Archaeological evidence for orpine cultivation comes from several Viking farmsteads, where the plant's distinctive leaf impressions have been found in clay and remnants identified in middens. Particularly telling are findings from settlements in Norway and the Viking colonies in Iceland, where orpine appears to have been deliberately planted near dwellings. Cultivation was straightforward. Orpine propagates easily from leaf cuttings or division, and once established, requires minimal care. Vikings typically grew it in rock gardens or stone wall crevices, locations that would be too dry for most other food plants. Some evidence suggests it was also grown on the sod roofs of Norse buildings, providing both food and additional waterproofing for the structure below. Talk about multifunctional gardening. Nutritionally, orpine offered something rare in the Viking diet: a fresh, vitamin-rich vegetable available even during drought conditions when other crops might fail. The leaves contain significant amounts of vitamin C and various minerals, while also providing a rare source of moisture in the diet. Modern analysis has confirmed what Vikings empirically discovered. Orpine contains compounds with genuine medicinal properties, including anti-inflammatory and wound-healing capabilities. In Viking cuisine, young orpine leaves and shoots were harvested in spring and early summer, when their flavour was mildest. They could be eaten raw in small quantities, adding a slightly acidic, sometimes peppery crunch to meals, somewhat like a more substantial purslane. More commonly, they were briefly boiled to remove some of the astringency, then added to stews or mixed with other greens. The plant's Norse name has been lost, but later Scandinavian folk traditions reveal that orpine had important cultural significance beyond just food. It was associated with protection against fire. Logical, given its water-storing properties, and in some regions was traditionally planted on roofs specifically to protect homes from lightning strikes and fire, a practice that continued in rural Scandinavia well into the 19th century. Orping's decline as a food plant began with the introduction of more productive vegetables that offered higher yields with less distinctive flavours. Its slight astringency and unusual texture fell out of favour as milder alternatives became available. By the medieval period, orpine had transitioned primarily to medicinal use, and by the Renaissance, it was more commonly grown as an ornamental plant than as food. Today, most gardeners who grow sedum varieties have no idea they're cultivating what was once an important survival food for their ancestors. The plant that helped Viking communities weather droughts and food shortages has been relegated to rock gardens and succulent collections, its culinary history almost completely forgotten. What makes orpine's story particularly poignant is how it represents the Viking talent for finding food in unlikely places. While modern agriculture focuses on transforming environments to suit our preferred crops, Vikings excelled at identifying and utilising plants already adapted to their challenging landscapes, a lesson in sustainability we might do well to remember. Cite Semus Alexander's Smyrnium olusatrum. If celery, parsley and angelica had a love child with attitude, it would be Alexander's. This robust Mediterranean plant, with its glossy leaves and distinctive yellow-green flowers, was brought to Northern Europe by Roman legions, but it was Viking communities who truly embraced it as a versatile food plant that could thrive in their coastal settlements. Standing up to 3 feet tall, with hollow stems and compound leaves, Alexander's makes quite the impression in the garden. Its name derives from Alexandria, Egypt, hinting at its ancient Mediterranean origins. Archaeological evidence confirms it was well established in Viking coastal communities by the 9th century, particularly in areas with milder climates like Denmark and parts of coastal Norway. The Vikings didn't introduce Alexander's to Scandinavia. Roman traders and earlier migrations had already established it, but they recognised its value and actively cultivated it where conditions allowed. Seed findings at several Viking trading posts suggest deliberate propagation rather than simply foraging wild plants. Cultivation was relatively straightforward for this hardy biennial. Vikings typically established it in sheltered areas with well-drained soil, often near settlements where it could benefit from additional protection. Once established, Alexander's readily self-seeds, creating sustainable colonies that provided food with minimal maintenance, exactly the kind of efficient food production that Norse communities valued. Nutritionally, Alexander's was a powerhouse, particularly valuable during late winter and early spring, when few other fresh greens were available. Rich in vitamin C, it helped prevent the scurvy that threatened northern populations dependent on stored foods through long winters. It also contains unique compounds that give it mild digestive and expectorant properties, benefits Vikings recognised even without understanding the specific chemistry involved. In the kitchen, Alexander's was the ultimate multi-purpose vegetable. Young shoots were harvested in early spring and eaten like asparagus. The mature leaves made a potent addition to stews and soups. The stems could be peeled and eaten raw or cooked, while the roots provided a starchy, aromatic food source during winter. Even the seeds were utilised as a peppery spice once dried, a welcome flavouring in the sometimes bland Norse diet. Perhaps most interestingly, Alexander's was one of the few vegetables that could be harvested year-round in coastal areas with milder climates. Different parts were simply collected as they reached their prime: roots in winter, young shoots in early spring, stems in late spring, leaves throughout summer, and seeds in fall. This extended harvest period made it particularly valuable in an era without refrigeration or global food supply chains. The decline of Alexander's coincided with the introduction of celery in the 16th and 17th centuries. Celery offered a milder flavour that appealed to changing European tastes, while Alexander's more robust aromatic profile gradually fell out of favour. By the 18th century, this once essential vegetable had largely disappeared from gardens, surviving primarily in monastic herb collections and as a naturalised plant along coastal areas. Today, Alexander's grows wild along coastlines throughout northern Europe, often mistaken for cow parsley or other umbellifers by people unaware of its rich culinary history. The plant that once provided year-round nutrition to Viking communities now grows largely unnoticed and unharvested, a living ghost of former food traditions. What makes Alexander's particularly fascinating is how it represents the practical adaptability of Viking food culture. Though not native to Scandinavia, it was embraced and integrated into Norse cuisine because it worked well within their environmental constraints, a reminder that Viking pragmatism often trumped cultural conservatism when survival was at stake. 8. Good King Henry, Chenopodium bonus Henricus. If vegetables had royal titles, Good King Henry earned its crown through sheer reliability. This unassuming perennial, with arrow-shaped leaves and clusters of inconspicuous flowers, was the medieval equivalent of a supermarket, providing greens, shoots and seeds from the same easy-to-grow plant year after year. Good King Henry resembles its cousin spinach, but with a more robust growth habit and distinctive triangular leaves. Archaeological evidence confirms it was cultivated throughout the Viking world, with seed remains found at numerous Norse settlements, dating from the 8th to 11th centuries. Particularly telling are findings from Longhouse Gardens, where Good King Henry appears to have been deliberately planted near kitchen areas for convenient harvest. The plant's curious name came much later. During the Viking Age, it was likely known by various local names that have been lost to history. Some linguistic evidence suggests it may have been called Stolt Henrik, Proud Henry, in parts of Scandinavia, perhaps referring to its upright growth habit. Cultivation couldn't have been simpler, a characteristic that made it invaluable to busy Viking households. Once established, Good King Henry returns year after year with minimal care, thriving in nitrogen-rich soil around settlements. Vikings typically planted it in dedicated perennial garden beds or near composting areas where it could benefit from household waste, an early example of integrated gardening systems. Nutritionally, Good King Henry was a standout performer in the Viking garden. Extremely rich in iron, calcium, and vitamins A and C, it provided crucial nutrients during the hunger gap of late winter and early spring, when other fresh foods were unavailable. Its mineral content made it particularly valuable for women during and after childbirth, a use documented in later medieval texts, but likely extending back to Viking times. In Norse kitchens, Good King Henry earned its keep through versatility. The young shoots, which emerge in early spring, were prepared like asparagus, a welcome fresh vegetable after months of preserved foods. The tender leaves could be eaten throughout summer, either cooked like spinach or added raw to salads in small quantities. Even the flower buds could be harvested and prepared similar to tiny broccoli florets. Perhaps most importantly, Good King Henry was one of the first green vegetables available each spring, sometimes pushing through the last snow to provide vital nutrition when winter stores were depleted. In this critical role, it quite literally helped Viking communities survive the transition between seasons when malnutrition was a serious threat. The decline of Good King Henry began gradually with the introduction of annual spinach from the Arab world during the late medieval period. Though spinach requires replanting each year and offers a shorter harvest window, its milder flavour and more tender leaves eventually won the popularity contest. By the 17th century, Good King Henry had been relegated primarily to medicinal use, and by the 19th century, it had largely disappeared from European gardens altogether. Today, this once essential vegetable survives primarily in heritage gardens and as a naturalised plant in parts of northern Europe, often growing around old monastery sites and abandoned settlements, living archaeological evidence of former cultivation. Most people who encounter it have no idea they're looking at a plant that helped countless generations survive European winters. What makes Good King Henry's story particularly relevant is how it exemplifies the shift from resilient perennial food systems to higher maintenance annual cropping. Vikings valued plants that provided reliable returns with minimal labour, a sharp contrast to our modern agricultural systems that prioritise yield over sustainability. In an era of climate uncertainty, perhaps good King Henry deserves its royal title back. 9. Bistort, Persicaria bistorta. In the damp meadows and stream edges of Viking territories grew a plant whose importance has been almost completely forgotten by modern food culture. Bistort, with its lance-shaped leaves and distinctive pink flower spikes, was once a crucial spring vegetable that helped Norse communities survive the dangerous hunger months, when winter stores ran low but new crops weren't yet ready. Bistort is an attractive perennial that grows in clumps, sending up poker-like pink flower spikes above basal rosettes of elongated leaves. The name comes from twice twisted, referring to its characteristically S-shaped roots. Archaeological evidence for its use comes primarily from pollen analysis at Viking settlements and the identification of root fragments in middens, suggesting it was both gathered wild and semi-cultivated. While not typically grown in formal garden plots, Vikings practiced a form of wild management with bistort, protecting existing stands, clearing competing vegetation, and sometimes transplanting roots closer to settlements for easier harvest. This approach to food production, somewhere between foraging and farming, was characteristic of Norse plant use, maximising returns while minimising labour. Found throughout Scandinavia, bistort thrived in the damp, acidic soils common in many Viking territories. It was particularly abundant in coastal Norway and parts of Sweden, where it often grew alongside streams or in meadows that were too wet for grain cultivation, turning otherwise unproductive land into valuable food sources. Nutritionally, bistort was a springtime lifesaver. The young leaves contain significant amounts of vitamin C, helping prevent the scurvy that threatened northern populations after months of preserved foods. The roots are rich in starch and tannins, providing both calories and compounds with medicinal properties. Modern analysis has confirmed what Vikings knew empirically. Bistort has genuine astringent and anti-inflammatory qualities that made it valuable beyond just nutrition. In Viking cuisine, bistort leaves were typically harvested in early spring when young and tender. They could be added to pottages, thick stews, briefly boiled like spinach, or mixed with other foraged greens in what later became known as dock pudding in parts of northern Europe. The roots, harvested in autumn, were typically dried and ground into powder that could be added to flour as an extender during food shortages, a practice that continued in rural Scandinavia into the 19th century. The plant's Norse name hasn't survived in written records, but linguistic evidence suggests it may have been called something similar to slangurt, snake plant, in some regions, possibly referring to its twisted roots or the snake-like appearance of its flower spikes. Bistort's decline as a food plant began with improved agricultural techniques that reduced the frequency of spring food shortages. As more reliable crops became available and food storage methods improved, the need for emergency spring greens gradually diminished. By the medieval period, bistort had transitioned primarily to medicinal use, valued for treating diarrhea and minor wounds rather than as a staple food. The final chapter in bistort's fall from culinary grace came with changing land use patterns. The damp meadows where it naturally thrived were increasingly drained for more conventional agriculture or development, dramatically reducing its natural habitat. Today, this once vital spring tonic survives primarily as an ornamental garden plant, its food history almost completely forgotten. What makes bistort's story particularly poignant is how it represents the Viking ability to create food security through intimate knowledge of their environment. Rather than relying solely on cultivated crops, Norse communities maintained a complex relationship with wild and semi-wild plants that provided crucial dietary insurance during difficult times, a sophisticated approach to food security that modern systems might learn from. 10th, marsh samphire, Salicornia europaea. Along the salt marshes and tidal flats that fringed Viking territories grew a peculiar succulent plant that looks more like underwater coral than terrestrial vegetation. Marsh samphire, with its jointed, fleshy stems and salt-loving nature, provided coastal Norse communities with both food and medicine from environments where few other edible plants could survive. Also known as glasswort or sea asparagus, marsh samphire stands about 6 to 12 inches tall with cylindrical, jointed stems that grow in dense colonies in salt-saturated soils. Archaeological evidence for its use comes primarily from coastal Viking settlements, where distinctive samphire seeds have been identified in middens and cooking pot residues, confirming it was regularly collected and consumed. Unlike many of our forgotten vegetables, samphire was never formally cultivated. It was harvested from wild stands in a sustainable management system. Vikings would carefully collect the tender young shoots during summer months, taking care not to damage the roots so plants would regenerate the following year. This approach, harvesting without depleting, characterised much of Norse interaction with coastal resources. Marsh samphire thrived in precisely the environments where conventional agriculture was impossible, the zone between land and sea that flooded regularly with salt water. By utilising this plant, Viking coastal communities effectively expanded their food-producing territory to include areas that would otherwise be agriculturally worthless, a clever adaptation to their challenging environment. Nutritionally, samphire was exceptional. Extremely rich in iodine, it helped prevent the goiter that commonly affected inland populations with iodine-deficient diets. It also contained significant amounts of vitamin C, minerals, and unique compounds that we now know have anti-inflammatory properties. Perhaps most importantly for coastal communities, its high salt content meant it could be eaten fresh without additional seasoning, a considerable advantage when salt was a valuable commodity. In Viking kitchens, samphire was typically harvested from midsummer through early fall, when the stems were tender but before they became woody. It was usually briefly boiled to reduce some of the saltiness and then eaten as a side dish or added to fish stews. Some evidence suggests it was also preserved through lactic fermentation, creating a pickle-like food that provided vitamin C through winter months. The plant's Norse name hasn't survived in written records, but linguistic evidence suggests it may have been called something similar to havgras, seagrass, in some regions. Whatever they called it, coastal Vikings clearly valued samphire highly. Archaeological evidence shows it was transported to inland settlements, suggesting it was traded beyond the immediate coastal areas where it grew. Samphire's decline as a food plant began gradually with changing tastes and the increasing availability of other vegetables. Its distinctly salty, somewhat crunchy texture, while perfect for accompanying fish, became less appreciated as milder vegetables gained popularity. By the post-medieval period, it had largely disappeared from common cuisine in most of northern Europe, though it maintained a presence in specialised regional dishes along some coastlines. The final blow came with extensive drainage and development of salt marshes during the industrial era, which dramatically reduced samphire's natural habitat. What had once been viewed as valuable foraging grounds came to be seen as wasteland, to be improved through drainage and conversion to conventional agriculture or industrial use. Today, marsh samphire has experienced something of a culinary revival, appearing on high-end restaurant menus as a gourmet ingredient, a far cry from its status as common coastal food during the Viking Age. This renaissance, while welcome, represents only a tiny fraction of the plant's former importance in coastal food systems. What makes samphire's story particularly relevant is how it exemplifies the Viking talent for finding nourishment in seemingly inhospitable environments. While modern agriculture typically transforms landscapes to suit our preferred crops, Vikings excelled at identifying and utilising plants already perfectly adapted to challenging conditions, an approach to food production that worked with nature rather than attempting to dominate it. 11th, burdock, Arctium lapa. In the disturbed soils around Viking settlements grew a plant that modern gardeners wage war against, but Norse communities welcomed as both food and medicine. Burdock, with its massive leaves and notorious sticky burrs, provided Viking households with a versatile root vegetable that could be harvested throughout the cold season when fresh food was scarce. Burdock is an imposing biennial that can grow over 5 feet tall in its second year, with rhubarb-sized leaves and purple thistle-like flowers that develop into the clingy burrs that inspired Velcro's invention. Archaeological evidence for its use comes from several Viking settlements, where burdock seeds and root fragments have been identified in middens and storage pits, suggesting deliberate cultivation rather than merely opportunistic foraging. The Vikings didn't introduce burdock to Scandinavia. It was already established across much of northern Europe. But they appear to have been among the first to systematically cultivate it as a food crop, rather than just a medicinal plant. Seed findings at several longhouse sites suggest intentional planting in designated areas, typically in the fertile, nitrogen-rich soil near settlement boundaries. Cultivation was straightforward. Burdock thrives in disturbed ground with minimal care. Vikings would typically harvest the roots of first-year plants in late autumn or early winter, when the energy stored in the roots was at its maximum, but before the ground froze solid. Some roots would be left to flower and set seed the following year, ensuring a continuous supply. Nutritionally, burdock root was exceptional for a winter vegetable. Rich in inulin, a prebiotic fibre, iron, manganese, and various antioxidant compounds, it provided crucial nutrition during the months when fresh vegetables were otherwise unavailable. Modern research has confirmed what Vikings apparently discovered through experience. Burdock has legitimate anti-inflammatory and digestive benefits that made it valuable beyond just calories. In Norse kitchens, burdock roots were typically cleaned, sliced, and added to stews or pottages, where their earthy flavour complemented meats and other root vegetables. They could also be roasted in the embers of a fire, developing a sweet, almost parsnip-like taste. Archaeological evidence suggests the roots were sometimes dried and ground into powder that could be added to flour as a nutritious extender, a practice that continued in rural Scandinavia during food shortages well into the medieval period. The young leaves and leaf stems were also collected in spring, providing a bitter but nutritious addition to the diet when few other greens were available. Even the peeled stalks of second-year plants could be harvested before they became too tough, prepared somewhat like cardoon or celery. Burdock's decline as a food plant in northern Europe began with the introduction of more productive root crops, particularly potatoes, in the post-medieval period. Its somewhat labour-intensive harvest, the roots can grow over 3 feet long, and distinctive earthy flavour gradually fell out of favour as alternatives became available. By the 18th century, it had largely transitioned to medicinal use in European traditions, though it maintained its status as a food plant in East Asian cuisines. Today, this once important root vegetable survives primarily as a persistent weed in much of its former range, its nutritional and culinary value largely forgotten by Western food cultures. Most people who battle burdock in their gardens have no idea they're ripping out what their ancestors carefully cultivated as winter sustenance. What makes burdock's story particularly relevant is how it exemplifies the Viking approach to food security through diversity. Rather than relying on just a few staple crops, Norse communities maintained a complex plant palette that included species with different growing requirements and harvest seasons, creating a food system with multiple backup options if any single crop failed. Dvanarksti bog myrtle, Myrica gale. Our final forgotten Viking vegetable isn't technically a vegetable at all, but rather a shrub whose aromatic leaves and catkins played a crucial role in Norse food preservation and flavouring. Bog myrtle, with its distinctive resinous scent and ability to thrive in wetlands where few other useful plants grow, was the Viking equivalent of both spice cabinet and food preservative. Growing up to 4 feet tall, with narrow toothed leaves and small catkins, bog myrtle forms dense thickets in acidic boggy areas throughout northern Europe, Archaeological evidence for its use is abundant. Charred remains have been found in numerous Viking cooking vessels, and the distinctive pollen appears in high concentrations around settlement sites, suggesting deliberate collection and possibly cultivation. While bog myrtle grows wild throughout much of Scandinavia, Vikings appear to have practiced a form of managed foraging, protecting existing stands, clearing competing vegetation, and possibly transplanting shrubs closer to settlements. Some archaeological evidence suggests they may have deliberately created suitable habitat by blocking streams to create the boggy conditions bog myrtle prefers, an early form of environmental engineering for food production. The shrub's Norse name was pors, still used in modern Scandinavian languages, and it was so valued that several place names throughout Viking territories reference locations where it grew abundantly. Historical records indicate it was sometimes traded between communities, with inland settlements exchanging goods for dried bog myrtle, harvested from coastal wetlands. What made bog myrtle particularly valuable was its unique chemical composition. The leaves and catkins contain powerful antimicrobial and insect repellent compounds, making it an effective food preservative in an era before refrigeration. It also contains aromatic oils that provided welcome flavouring for the sometimes bland Norse diet. Modern analysis has confirmed what Vikings discovered through experience. Bog myrtle has legitimate preservative properties comparable to hops. In Viking food culture, bog myrtle served multiple purposes. The dried leaves were used to line storage containers for grains and legumes, helping prevent insect infestation and mould growth. Fresh or dried leaves were added to soups and stews as a bay leaf-like flavouring. Perhaps most importantly, bog myrtle was a crucial ingredient in preserving meat and fish, both as a surface treatment and as an addition to smoking mixtures. Bog myrtle's most famous use was in grut, the herbal mixture used to flavour and preserve beer before hops became the standard. Archaeological evidence from several Viking brewing sites has revealed bog myrtle remains, confirming its importance in Norse brewing traditions. The slightly resinous, bitter flavour it imparted also helped balance the sweetness of early medieval beers, which often relied on honey for fermentable sugars. The decline of bog myrtle in European food systems began with the adoption of hops as the standard beer preservative during the medieval period. Hops provided longer preservation and a more standardised flavour, gradually replacing the regional grut mixtures that had characterised earlier brewing. By the 16th century, laws in many parts of Europe actually mandated the use of hops and prohibited grut, effectively eliminating bog myrtle's most important culinary role. As a food flavouring and preservative, bog myrtle was gradually replaced by imported spices as trade routes expanded and previously exotic ingredients became more accessible. By the 18th century, it had largely disappeared from European kitchens, surviving primarily in folk medicine and as an occasional flavouring in regional spirits. Today, bog myrtle has experienced a modest revival among craft brewers interested in historical brewing methods, but its wider culinary applications remain largely forgotten. The shrub that once helped preserve Viking food supplies now grows unnoticed in wetlands across northern Europe, its aromatic leaves releasing their distinctive scent when crushed, a sensory ghost of former food traditions. What makes bog myrtle's story particularly fascinating is how it represents the Viking talent for finding utility in every available ecological niche. By utilising plants from wetlands that couldn't support conventional agriculture, Norse communities effectively expanded their resource base beyond the limitations of arable land, a sophisticated approach to environmental management that modern food systems might learn from. As our longship journey through Viking vegetable gardens comes to an end, we're left with a profound appreciation for the ingenuity and ecological wisdom of Norse food systems. These 12 forgotten vegetables, from the medicinal power of angelica to the preservative properties of bog myrtle, reveal a society that maintained intimate knowledge of their environment and developed sophisticated strategies for survival in challenging conditions. What strikes me most about these vanished vegetables isn't just their nutritional value, or culinary versatility, but how they represent a fundamentally different relationship with food and landscape. Vikings didn't attempt to transform their environment to suit a few preferred crops. Instead, they cultivated an extensive knowledge of plants, already adapted to local conditions, creating a food system that worked with nature rather than against it. The diversity of their plant use is particularly impressive. By utilising everything from coastal salt marshes, samphire, to boggy wetlands, bog myrtle, rocky outcrops, orpine, to fertile settlement edges, burdock. Viking communities effectively expanded their productive landscape far beyond conventional field agriculture. This approach created remarkable resilience. If one food source failed, others in different ecological niches might still thrive. Perhaps most importantly, these forgotten vegetables remind us that our ancestors understood food security in ways we've largely forgotten. The Viking vegetable palette wasn't just about calories. It provided crucial nutrients through changing seasons, medicine for common ailments, and preservation techniques for extending the usable life of other foods. Each plant had multiple functions in a beautifully integrated system. So what can modern eaters learn from these vanished Viking vegetables? First, that true food security comes through diversity rather than monoculture. Second, that resilient food systems work with local environmental conditions rather than constantly fighting against them. And finally, that the most nutritious and sustainable foods might be hiding in plain sight, growing as weeds in our gardens or along shorelines we pass without a second glance. As climate change creates new challenges for global agriculture, perhaps it's time to reconsider some of these forgotten food plants. Many, like good King Henry, sea kale and burdock, are remarkably drought-resistant, pest-resistant, and capable of thriving with minimal inputs. Others contain nutritional profiles superior to their modern replacements, offering potential health benefits we're only beginning to understand. The Vikings weren't perfect. Their society had plenty of problems we wouldn't want to replicate. But their pragmatic approach to food production offers valuable lessons for contemporary challenges. They understood that survival required working with the full palette of what nature provided, not just the handful of crops that were easiest to commercialise. So the next time you pull a weed from your garden, pause for a moment. That persistent plant might be one that nourished your ancestors through countless harsh winters. It might contain nutrients missing from modern diets. And it just might represent a piece of botanical wisdom we would do well to remember before it vanishes completely into the mists of time. If this journey through Viking vegetables has stirred your curiosity, maybe it's time to look at the plants around you a little differently. The knowledge that once fed entire communities doesn't have to remain buried in the past. Rediscovering these lost crops isn't just about nostalgia. It's about reconnecting with resilient food traditions that could help us face an uncertain future. What do you think? Could these ancient plants make a comeback in modern kitchens and gardens? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten Viking foods, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. There's so much more history growing just beneath the surface. Thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes the seeds of the future are hidden in the roots of the past.